The call to the police hotline was calm and clear. A man informed the operator that a strong smell of decomposition had been coming from a neighbor's shed for several days. He emphasized that the smell was getting worse and was now unbearable. When the police arrived at the scene, the smell was noticeable even before they entered the property. The caller turned out to be James Lee, a new neighbor who had recently moved with his family to the rural Wairarapa region of New Zealand. The shed he complained about belonged to a local farmer, Thomas Greenway, a well-known man in the area. 7 years earlier, Thomas had lost his wife, Eliza. At the time, the police considered her disappearance voluntary, as her car had been found at the Remutaka Pass. Thomas had seemed devastated and raised no suspicions. When questioned by the patrol about the smell, Thomas answered confidently and without hesitation that it was likely an animal that had recently died on his property. The police checked the area around the shed, but found nothing of the sort. It became clear that the source of the smell was inside. In the shed, under a pile of old tools and junk, one of the officers noticed a metal hatch. When the hatch was opened, their suspicions were confirmed. Human remains were discovered in a small concrete cellar. A few days later, a forensic examination officially confirmed that the woman found was Eliza Greenway, who had been considered missing for the past 7 years. Thus, an ordinary call to the police hotline marked the beginning of one of the most unexpected investigations in the county, and cast doubt on everything known about the quiet and reclusive farmer, Thomas Greenway. The Greenway family farm was located in the rural Wairarapa region. It was a large property with pastures, several old buildings, and a farmhouse. Eliza Greenway had inherited the farm from her parents and managed it herself. She personally controlled the finances, bank accounts, and documents related to the land. Neighbors described her as an independent and responsible person. Thomas, her husband, usually did not get involved in legal and financial matters, dealing only with the daily chores of the farm, purchases, repairs, and equipment. In the spring of 2015, the family's life changed dramatically. Eliza lost their first child, whom she and Thomas had been waiting for a long time. It was a severe shock for her. After this event, she stopped communicating with others, became withdrawn, and rarely left the house. Doctors later confirmed that she had developed a severe emotional condition and deep depression. It was then that Thomas, for the first time, began to actively handle all external affairs on his own. He started going to the bank more often and consulting with lawyers. He explained to neighbors and acquaintances that he was just helping Eliza until she recovered. People accepted this, given the difficult situation in the family. It never occurred to anyone to doubt his words or check the documents. Only several years later, during the official investigation, would it be revealed that between 2015 and 2016, Thomas had been re-registering plots of land. He conducted transactions related to subdividing the farm and selling parts of it. But back in 2015-2016, no one in the area suspected any land deals, as all the documents looked legitimate and did not attract undue attention. By mid-2016, Eliza was no longer seen at all. Thomas assured neighbors that her health had deteriorated and she didn't want to see anyone. People believed him, understanding the seriousness of the situation. The farm continued to operate. Chores were carried out as usual, and Thomas looked tired but perfectly capable of managing the situation. Thus, behind a seemingly calm life, a completely different reality was hidden, the details of which would only begin to surface when the police took the Greenway family case seriously. On May 19, 2016, at about 10 in the morning, Thomas Greenway went to the local police station to report his wife missing. The officer who took his statement later recalled that Thomas was calm, though a little flustered. He said that he and Eliza had had an argument the previous evening, after which she had suddenly decided to leave home. Thomas added that Eliza had been depressed in recent months, and he hadn't stopped her, thinking she just needed some time to be alone. He also explained that he had tried to call her that morning, but Eliza's phone was out of network range. The initial police reaction was standard and not overly alarmed. That same day, a group of officers went to the Greenway farm to conduct a brief inspection. They checked the house, the grounds, and the outbuildings. They found nothing unusual. Everything was in its place. The house was neat, with no signs of a struggle or disorder. Thomas voluntarily accompanied the police, calmly answering questions, not evading conversation, and willingly showing them everything they asked to see. However, the officers limited themselves to a rather superficial search. At that moment, the situation did not seem criminal, so the search of the property was more of a formality. The check lasted less than an hour. Thomas was also briefly questioned on the spot, asked to repeat the timeline of events, after which his statement was recorded. At that point, none of the police officers doubted his story. It sounded plausible and fully consistent with the picture described by the neighbors. At this stage, Eliza Greenway's disappearance was recorded in police reports as a standard domestic case, a voluntary departure after a family conflict. The officers assumed the woman would probably return home on her own or make contact soon. That day, no one considered the disappearance as anything serious or unusual. Thomas returned to his business, believing the situation was under control and would soon be resolved. But just a couple of days later, when the police conducted a more detailed check of the circumstances, the first details would emerge that would force them to reconsider their initial conclusions. The first 24 hours after the report was filed passed in tense anticipation. Relatives, friends, and the police assumed that Eliza Greenway would either return home on her own or at least get in touch to explain where she had gone. Thomas himself tried not to panic and remained calm, constantly assuring the police of his willingness to help the investigation. But when the first day passed, and then the second, it became clear that the situation would not resolve itself. The station was ordered to take active measures and check all possible routes the woman might have taken. About 48 hours had passed since Eliza's disappearance when a police patrol discovered her car. The vehicle was parked on the side of the road leading to the Remutaka Pass, a secluded and gloomy place about 50 kilometers from the Greenway farm. The location was known to locals and police as a remote and seldom visited stretch of road with poor reception and difficult terrain. Therefore, finding the car here immediately raised alarm and many theories among the officers. Eliza's car looked as if she had stopped there briefly, as if intending to return soon and continue on her way. The doors were closed but not locked, and the keys were still in the ignition. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Her handbag with documents, a wallet with money, a mobile phone, and a warm jacket were on the seat. Nothing looked moved or touched by anyone else. Everything indicated that Eliza had left the car calmly and voluntarily, not planning to be away for long. But what was strange was that the car had obviously been there all night. The windows were covered with a thick layer of morning dew. The police quickly launched a detailed search of the area adjacent to where the car was found. They carefully examined the roadside, the nearby forest, every meter of the road, and the surroundings. They worked meticulously, trying not to miss a single clue that could shed light on the woman's route after she got out of the car. However, despite all their efforts, no traces of her movement were found. No broken branches, no footprints, not even the slightest sign that someone had recently passed through here. It felt as if Eliza had simply vanished into thin air. Simultaneously, the police checked the phone found in the car. The battery was completely dead, and attempts to determine its location via cell tower signals were unsuccessful. The officers knew that due to the remoteness and difficult terrain of the Ramutica Pass, mobile service there was unstable and, in some places, completely absent. Therefore, the chance of tracking the phone via the cellular network was minimal. This complicated the situation, but further supported the theory that Eliza might have come to this place intentionally, knowing about the poor reception and the inability to be reached. Meanwhile, parallel to the search of the area, additional information was being actively gathered at the police station. Officers contacted Eliza's doctor again, who confirmed that she had been suffering from a serious emotional disorder for a long time, was in a deep depression, and had a tendency to isolate herself. These statements were corroborated by the woman's neighbors and acquaintances, who had previously noted her reclusiveness and reluctance to maintain contact with the outside world. With each passing hour, the theory of the woman's voluntary disappearance became more and more convincing. The police gradually leaned toward the idea that Eliza had independently decided to leave her old life behind. The location where the car was found also played a role. The Ramutica Pass had long had a reputation as a remote and inaccessible area, suitable for disappearing without a trace. The officers working at the scene exchanged thoughts, and many of them openly admitted that they simply couldn't imagine any other scenario. By evening, having completed all possible on-site activities, the investigation team prepared a detailed report, attaching photographs, video materials, and a description of every action. These documents were sent to the head of the department, who immediately called an emergency meeting to decide on the next steps. During this meeting, the officers reached a consensus. Large-scale searches involving volunteer groups, helicopters, and dog handlers were pointless. The absence of visible signs of a crime, the calm emotional context of the situation, and the lack of contradictions in the husband's story all fit perfectly with the initial version of a voluntary departure. Thus, the version of events initially presented by Thomas Greenway received official confirmation and was recorded as the most probable. For the police, this was a logical and predictable outcome. None of the investigators asked extra questions or saw any reason to doubt Thomas's sincerity or to look for alternative possibilities. The story seemed completely finished and understandable, and further investigation was reduced to mere formalities and waiting for possible new facts to emerge. At that moment, no one suspected that after some time, completely new circumstances would arise that would completely overturn the case and make all the investigators doubt everything they had believed to be true. But in the first days after Eliza's disappearance, it seemed that the story had already reached its logical conclusion, and nothing else could possibly be discovered. Despite the officially accepted theory of Eliza's voluntary departure, the police were still obligated to follow standard procedure. And those rules clearly state, in cases of a person's disappearance, the closest relative, in this case the husband, Thomas Greenway, is always checked first. Even if his story sounded convincing and consistent with the collected facts, the police were obliged to formally eliminate him from the list of suspects. On May 20, 2016, investigators obtained a warrant to conduct a full search of Thomas's farm. Early that morning, a group of officers arrived at his property to carry out a thorough inspection of all premises. A canine unit, capable of detecting even the most subtle traces, was brought in to assist in the operation. Thomas reacted to the police's actions calmly, showing neither irritation nor any attempt to hinder the investigators' work. He voluntarily accompanied them through the house, provided access to all closets and rooms, and showed them his computer and personal belongings. The search of the house yielded no results. The officers found no evidence that could arouse suspicion. After checking the house, the police moved on to inspect the other buildings on the farm. An old wooden shed at the far end of the property drew particular attention. It was located right on the border of a vacant neighboring lot, which was for sale at the time. The shed itself was used to store old equipment, fertilizers, and fuel. Thomas explained that he had recently moved several bags of saltpeter and cans of diesel fuel there for the farm machinery. When the police opened the shed door, they were immediately met with a strong smell of chemicals, diesel and saltpeter. At first, the officers tried to inspect the premises themselves, but apart from scattered equipment, cans, and bags, they found nothing noteworthy. It was then decided to bring in the service dog to eliminate any doubt about the thoroughness of the search. However, the attempt to use the canine unit failed immediately. The dog could not cope with the strong chemical smell and became disoriented. According to the handler's report, the animal simply could not distinguish any odors under these conditions. The police made several attempts to redirect the dog, but each time the animal refused to enter the shed and began to act restlessly. The investigators considered this sufficient reason to stop the inspection of the shed at that time. Next, the police carefully inspected the garage and other outbuildings on the property. They checked the agricultural machinery, tools, and the surrounding area. No signs of any manipulation or suspicious activity were found. The house and garage were orderly, which did not indicate any haste or attempts to hide or destroy any evidence. At the end of the day, the investigators summarized their findings. Based on all the collected materials, it was clear that there was no direct evidence or any signs of Thomas's involvement in Eliza's disappearance. His behavior, the absence of signs of a struggle, or any suspicious circumstances in the house and on the farm gave the police no reason to continue actively suspecting him. The officers considered the matter with the husband to be definitively closed at this stage. In the official documents, the police recorded that the check of Thomas Greenway and his farm was conducted thoroughly and yielded no results. The conditions of the shed inspection were described in detail, and the inability of the service dog to work due to the chemical odors was recognized as an objective obstacle. The investigators then decided not to return for a repeat inspection of the shed, considering the situation understandable and explainable. That day, Thomas Greenway was formally removed from the list of suspects. The investigators did not doubt the plausibility of his words or the sincerity of his behavior. At this stage of the investigation, the story seemed completely clear and logical to the police. None of the investigation team guessed that at that very moment, the only chance to uncover the truth before the case reached a dead end had been missed. After the police were finally convinced that Thomas Greenway was not involved in his wife's disappearance, the only remaining place to search was the Ramutica Pass. The car found there was the only real lead for the investigation, and all police resources were directed to that area. The operation began 3 days after Eliza's car was discovered. The search and rescue team consisted of police officers, local volunteers, and rescuers accustomed to the difficult conditions of the mountainous terrain. They were confident that sooner or later they would find traces of the woman and be able to reconstruct her path. But from the very first stages of the search, they encountered serious difficulties. On the first day, a canine unit joined the search. The police officers expected that specially trained dogs would quickly pick up a scent trail from the car and indicate the exact direction of Eliza's movement. But the situation turned out to be unexpected. The search dogs started work confidently, but after just a few meters from the car, they would stop abruptly. They behaved as if Eliza's trail suddenly vanished into thin air. The handlers made several more attempts, each time starting from the car. However, the result was always the same. Later, the official report from the canine unit provided an explanation. Heavy rains that had occurred shortly after the woman's disappearance had washed away or significantly weakened all possible scent trails. The rocky soil and constantly changing wind characteristic of the pass area also played a role. This made further searches with dogs practically useless. The handlers deemed repeated attempts inadvisable, and the police abandoned them. Nevertheless, the other search activities continued in full scale. Helicopters surveyed every square meter of the terrain, using high-resolution cameras and thermal imagers. On the ground, volunteers and rescuers methodically inspected every trail, gorge, and slope. The search party moved slowly and carefully, hoping to find any clues: clothing, personal items, or signs of human presence. However, with each passing day, the confidence of the operation's participants dwindled. The search lasted for a week, then was extended for another. The volunteers began to tire and gradually returned home. The rescue teams had to admit that under these conditions and with this approach, it was pointless to continue. Not a single lead had emerged. Nothing was found that could explain where Eliza Greenway had gone. After almost 3 weeks, the police officially announced the end of the active search phase. The final report was brief. No signs of a struggle or violent acts were found, and there were no signs of the missing person's presence at the pass. Eliza was officially declared a missing person, and the case was archived and deemed unsolved. Thomas Greenway gradually returned to his usual life. The neighbors got used to seeing him as a man who had suffered a great loss. He rarely left the farm, hardly appeared in public, and avoided conversations about what had happened. In the eyes of those around him, he became a grieving widower, worthy of sympathy and respect. No one asked him any unnecessary questions. Thus began the longest phase of this case, 7 years of silence. During these years, no one revisited Eliza's case, and it seemed that everything had long been forgotten and definitively closed. No one knew that years later, this silence would be broken in a completely unexpected way. 7 years had passed since Eliza's disappearance. Much had changed in the area during that time, but not the life of Thomas Greenway. He still lived alone on his farm, avoiding inviting anyone over, but he did not withdraw from communication outside his property. He was often seen in town at the post office, the store, or the gas station, always polite, neat, and reserved. When the police reopened the case in 2023 and began questioning people living nearby, investigators expected to hear at least something that would point to oddities in Greenway's behavior. But they heard something completely different. Greenway's farm was in a remote rural area where neighboring houses could be miles apart. People lived separately, so no one could hear what was happening in Thomas's house. All judgments about him were based only on rare encounters, casual conversations, exchanging news at the market, or crossing paths on a country road. An elderly neighbor who lived closest said she rarely saw Greenway, mostly when he helped her with her fence or once gave her a ride to town. According to her, Thomas was a quiet, neat, reserved man who always said hello and didn't talk about personal matters. She stressed that she had never noticed anything strange about him, adding, "After what happened, he just got quieter." Another neighbor, the owner of a large pasture nearby, said much the same thing. Thomas didn't do noisy work, didn't invite guests, and didn't meddle in other people's affairs. Sometimes he would come by to buy animal feed or offer help with equipment repair. The man described him as someone who lives by the rules, who does everything measuredly and without fuss. A young couple who bought a plot of land next door in 2020 said they only learned about his story later from other residents. Thomas gave them the impression of a man who preferred solitude, but remained friendly. He would sometimes bring them vegetables and fruit, but never came into the house. He preferred to talk briefly and leave. He doesn't seem like someone who wants to be alone out of fear or guilt. He just lives alone and doesn't seek company, they noted in their statements. During the interviews, one detail concerning the land emerged. Several neighbors mentioned that Greenway's farm had become significantly smaller than before. According to one of the old-timers, he had supposedly sold part of the territory many years ago, explaining that it was impossible for one person to maintain the entire farm. No one remembered exactly when this happened. For everyone, it was an old, long-past event unrelated to Eliza's disappearance. The police noted this comment, but did not attach much importance to it. Investigators also checked official records. All documents looked impeccable. Taxes were paid, property was correctly registered, and there were no deaths. Thomas behaved flawlessly. He had no legal trouble, did not break the law, and gave no cause for suspicion. His life appeared transparent and predictable. It was also noted that in all 7 years, Greenway had not started any new relationships and had not left the area. This was perceived as natural. In the eyes of the locals, he remained a man who simply could not get over his loss. He was described as honest, reserved, and a bit reclusive, but polite and decent. No one saw him as a threat or secretive. By the end of the series of interviews, the police had to admit the obvious. Thomas Greenway behaved impeccably. There were no oddities, conflicts, complaints, or even minor rumors surrounding him. It seemed as if the investigation was dealing with a man who had truly lived these 7 years in solitude and peace, tending to his farm and never making a misstep. And it was precisely this calmness that became the most alarming thing in this story. When everything fits together too perfectly, when a person looks flawless, there remains a feeling that the solution must lie somewhere beyond his external life, in things that no one had seen and no one had ever checked. August 2023 became a turning point in Thomas Greenway's story. After 7 years of quiet life, his isolation was suddenly broken. The cause was not police action or a random event, but a simple confluence of circumstances. The Lee family moved onto the neighboring plot, which had long been vacant and for sale. The move of a new family would not in itself have raised questions from the police or local residents. People often bought land in the area and started construction. It was a common occurrence. However, for Thomas, the arrival of neighbors proved to be a serious problem. The reason lay in the location of the buildings. Since the land had been subdivided, Thomas's property had shrunk significantly, and the old wooden shed was now located literally on the edge of his territory, right on the property line. The shed was not just an abandoned structure. Thomas visited it constantly, storing equipment, fertilizers, and agricultural chemicals there. That was why the presence of strangers nearby could have caused him anxiety. The Lee family, who had moved to the adjacent lot, wanted to start building their new house as soon as possible. By law, any residential structures must be located no closer than 40 meters from the property line. Documents later examined by the police indicated that the Lees had placed their temporary mobile home at the minimum permitted distance, exactly 40 meters from the boundary. They chose this spot for practical reasons: closer to the road, a water source, and connected utilities. None of them knew that just beyond the border stood an old shed that would become the center of the future investigation. For Thomas, this meant that his constant visits to the shed could attract the attention of his new neighbors. Whereas before, there had been empty land all around, and no one noticed how often he visited the shed or what he did there, the situation had now completely changed. Every one of his visits could be seen by prying eyes, and Thomas began to show nervousness. He started checking the shed more often, coming early in the morning or late in the evening, avoiding encounters with the Lee family. The Lee family, however, noticed nothing suspicious in his behavior. They assumed their neighbor was used to living alone, so they simply tried not to cross his boundaries or impose their friendship on him. The new neighbors calmly went about setting up and watching the construction of their home, unaware of how much their presence might be troubling Thomas. The investigators, re-examining the situation, realized that the long-standing isolation in which Thomas had existed had now physically disappeared. Simple math confirmed it. The distance from Thomas's shed to the Lees' mobile home was exactly 40 meters. What had previously gone unnoticed by everyone was now accessible to casual observation. 7 years of tranquility, in which Greenway had felt safe, came to an end in an instant. It was this external circumstance, the arrival of new neighbors, that became the first step toward new details emerging in the story of Eliza's disappearance. What Thomas had carefully hidden for many years was suddenly under threat of exposure. The arrival of the Lee family became a key point in this story. Their decision to place their temporary home in that specific spot broke Thomas's 7-year isolation and literally brought the truth to the surface. Everything he had hidden under his shed was now out in the open. The Lee family could no longer stand it. The smell, which at first had seemed harmless, was now so strong that in the evening the air around their mobile home became literally thick. They already knew where it was coming from: Thomas Greenway's farm. For several days they tried not to get involved, but when the wind shifted again and the smell became unbearable, the Lees called the police. A patrol car arrived during the day. Greenway's property looked well kept, but as soon as the officers approached the shed, it became clear. The smell was indeed coming from there. Thomas met them at the gate. He spoke calmly, but was rigid, as if he had prepared his answer in advance. "A cow died a couple of days ago. I buried it near the shed," he explained, without waiting for questions. The police asked to be shown the spot. Thomas led them to the far edge of the property and pointed to a patch of ground, but the officers quickly noticed an inconsistency. No signs of digging, no fresh earth, no shovel marks. Everything looked untouched. Meanwhile, the smell was getting stronger, not from outside, but from inside the shed. The officers then decided to check the building. Inside, it was a mess. Canisters, fertilizers, old tools, bags of soil. One of the policemen noticed that in one corner, the junk was piled more densely than in other places, as if someone had deliberately tried to cover something up. When the boards and bags were moved, a metal hatch was discovered underneath. Thomas immediately turned pale. He tried to explain that there was just a cellar under the shed where old supplies were once stored, but the officers decided to check. The hatch was opened slowly. A thick, stale smell immediately hit them from within. One of the policemen shone a flashlight inside and noticed pieces of fabric and items that looked like clothing on the floor. That was enough to stop. The patrol immediately reported to headquarters, and soon criminologists and forensic experts arrived at the scene. The area was cordoned off, the shed was closed, and Thomas was taken aside for questioning. When the experts descended into the cellar, they began to document the findings. At a depth of about 1.5 meters, remains were discovered, along with personal belongings, including a piece of jewelry and several household items. Everything was carefully packaged and sent to the laboratory for analysis. A few days later, a DNA test confirmed what the investigators had already suspected. The remains belonged to Eliza Greenway, the woman who had disappeared from this farm 7 years ago. This discovery completely destroyed the previous theory of a voluntary departure. Now, the investigation faced a completely different task: to reconstruct the sequence of events of 2016 and understand how Thomas had managed to keep such a terrible secret right under his shed for so many years. After the experts confirmed that the remains found under the shed belonged to Eliza Greenway, investigators re-examined the materials from the search conducted in 2016. The farm had been thoroughly inspected back then with the help of a canine unit. Yet the search dog had not indicated the shed as a suspicious location. Now, the investigation had to figure out why the dog had failed to perform its primary function that day. Studying the old reports, the investigators reconstructed the timeline of the search. The documents stated, "The dog, having picked up Eliza's scent, immediately headed confidently toward the shed. But just before the entrance, its behavior changed. The animal slowed down, became wary, began to circle restlessly near the door, and flatly refused to go inside. At the time, the handler assumed the dog had simply lost the trail or was distracted by an extraneous scent unrelated to a human. The police concluded there was no point in inspecting the shed, as there were no visible signs that anything was being hidden inside. In 2023, investigators sent criminologists back to the Greenway farm. Now, after the discovery of the body, they carefully examined the shed and the hatch itself. Numerous samples were taken from the surfaces and the ground near the entrance to the cellar. Chemical analysis of these samples yielded unexpected and clear results. All surfaces near the entrance were saturated with diesel fuel and nitrate fertilizers. Such a mixture has an extremely strong and pungent chemical odor, capable of overpowering any other sense. The criminologists explained that for a search dog, such a concentration of chemical odors becomes an impassable barrier. It completely blocks its ability to detect faint human scent trails. It was now clear to the investigators. In 2016, this was not an accidental failure of the canine unit, but the result of premeditated actions. The diesel cans and bags of saltpeter looked like ordinary farm clutter, but in reality, someone had deliberately placed them to confuse the search team. Forensic medical examiners also provided unexpected information to the investigation. According to the report, Eliza had died approximately 1 month before her body was discovered in 2023, not 7 years ago as initially assumed. She had been alive all those years, held in that very room under the shed. At the time of her disappearance, the woman was physically healthy, but prolonged isolation without proper nutrition and care gradually led to emaciation, which ultimately caused her death. These findings forced the police to reconsider the theory of Eliza's voluntary departure. In 2016, her car was found at the Ramutica Pass, which had convinced the investigation that the woman had decided to leave on her own. Now, it was obvious that the car had been deliberately driven to a remote location to lead the police as far away from the farm as possible. As a result, the investigation concluded that there were no coincidences in this case. Everything, from the masking of smells to the false trail with the car, was part of one well-thought-out scheme. And the main suspect in organizing this plan was the person who had been closest to the investigation all these years: Eliza's husband, Thomas Greenway. The investigators now had to figure out how he had managed to hide the truth for so long and so carefully, right under everyone's nose. After Thomas Greenway's arrest, investigators focused on the main thing: finding out what exactly had caused the events to unfold. They already knew that Eliza had been held captive for years, but they didn't understand why Thomas would hide it all. To find the answer, they needed to follow the money, because the root of such stories almost always lies in financial motives. The police began with a classic check. Financial crime experts examined Greenway's accounts, his tax returns, loans, and assets. At first glance, everything looked perfectly ordinary. Small income from farm work, stable utility payments, no suspicious account activity. However, it was this impeccable normalcy that alerted the investigation. A farmer who owned a significant amount of land simply couldn't have such a flat financial background. In late October 2023, the police returned to Greenway's house with a new warrant. This time, investigators were not looking for physical evidence, but for documents. The search was detailed. They checked safes, personal folders, and old furniture. It wasn't until late in the evening that a criminologist noticed a small key in a writing desk. Attached to it was a crumpled rental agreement for a bank safe deposit box, dated April 2016. The paper looked old, with the logo of one of the banks in Masterton. Investigators immediately sent an inquiry to the bank to confirm the rental. A few days later, a response came. The box did exist, was registered in Thomas Greenway's name, and had been paid for without interruption for all 7 years. Bank employees also reported that the owner visited the box infrequently, only a few times, with the last visit occurring about a month before his arrest. This was enough for the court to issue a warrant. The procedure took several more days. The bank acted strictly according to protocol, and the police were present for the entire process. When the lid of the box was opened, inside were several neatly stacked folders and a thick envelope. The papers were clean, dry, with no signs of age, as if they had been deliberately stored in perfect conditions. The experts began to carefully review the documents, and it soon became clear why Thomas had kept them secret. Inside were notarized copies of contracts for the subdivision of the farm's land. According to the documents, Eliza Greenway had supposedly voluntarily agreed to sell 80% of her land. All the papers were dated April 2016, just a month before her disappearance. The transactions looked official, with notarized signatures, bank details, and seals. But a close inspection revealed one strange coincidence. All of Eliza's signatures were identical, as if copied. A handwriting analysis confirmed it. The signatures were forged. Thomas had used samples of her handwriting found in old documents and carefully transferred them onto the new papers. He had prepared fraudulent deals in advance, selling 80% of the land and receiving a substantial sum for it. When investigators compared the bank transactions, the puzzle came together completely. The money from the sale was deposited into Thomas's account in May 2016, just days after Eliza's disappearance. A portion of the sum was soon transferred to a foreign account registered under a false name. Now the motive was obvious. Thomas was in debt and knew that he couldn't dispose of the land without his wife's signature. He pulled off a scam, staged her departure, and then diverted the police's attention to the Ramutica Pass, faking the voluntary disappearance story. All these years, he had lived on the remaining part of the farm, not spending the money he had received and maintaining the appearance of a normal life. Investigators also found confirmation that Thomas had consulted a lawyer in 2016 to draw up several powers of attorney in Eliza's name. The lawyer confirmed that at the time, he had found the client's behavior strange. Greenway was in a hurry, spoke quietly, and avoided specific questions. This was another detail confirming that the scam had been planned in advance, and then created a perfect illusion of tragedy. After opening the box, the investigation was finally convinced this was not a spontaneous crime, but a cold, calculated plan. The motive was found. The money explained everything. Why Eliza disappeared, why the police believed in her voluntary departure, and why Thomas lived quietly for 7 years without raising suspicion. The investigation had to figure out the last piece, how exactly he had managed to hold Eliza captive all those years, and why no one in the area suspected a thing. After the police obtained evidence of Thomas Greenway's involvement, he was taken to the Masterton station for a formal interrogation. He sat at a table across from 2 detectives, silently staring at the table. The investigators started immediately with the key facts. In front of Thomas, they laid out photos and reports from the criminologists at the scene where Eliza's remains were found. The officer clearly explained. The experts had confirmed her identity and determined that the woman had been alive for all 7 years, held right there on Thomas's farm. Greenway said nothing, but his breathing became noticeably heavier. Then the investigator moved on to the main motive. He presented Thomas with copies of the documents found in the safe deposit box, the land sale contracts, and the handwriting expert's conclusion about the forgery of Eliza's signatures. Greenway began to get nervous, carefully examining the papers and avoiding eye contact. The investigator also noted that the money from the sale had quickly gone to a foreign account, and the entire chain of transfers would soon be fully uncovered. The final blow for Thomas was the testimony of the lawyer who had noticed his strange behavior back in 2016. The officer emphasized that the investigation now had all the necessary evidence for a trial, and for Thomas, the only reasonable decision would be to cooperate with the police. A short pause followed. For the first time during the conversation, Thomas raised his eyes and looked at the investigator. After a moment's hesitation, he began to speak. In a calm, quiet voice, he confessed that he had personally driven Eliza's car to the Ramutica Pass and had deliberately masked the smell in the shed with chemicals, knowing about the search with dogs. He explained his actions as panic at the prospect of his financial fraud being exposed. The most difficult confession was that Eliza had indeed remained in the cellar of the shed all those years. Thomas briefly explained. He had only planned to hide her for a short time, but things got out of control, and a temporary solution turned into a years-long secret. Now the police had complete clarity. It was the financial scam that had pushed Thomas to such radical actions. With every word, Greenway revealed more details, understanding that only full cooperation could have any impact on his future. The investigators just had to find out the last thing, how Thomas had managed to keep this terrible secret from everyone around him for so many years. Thomas's testimony was important, but the investigators needed ironclad proof. Simple words and confessions are not enough for a court. Any detail could undermine all the police's work. The main doubt concerned the documents for the sale of the farmland. To make the case irrefutable, they needed to definitively confirm that the signatures were forged. The investigators sent the papers for handwriting analysis to the forensic laboratory of the Ministry of Justice in Wellington. The work was complex and meticulous. The specialists requested as many samples of Eliza's original handwriting as possible: personal diaries, letters to friends and relatives, checks she had signed, and official documents created before her disappearance in 2016. The comparison was made based on several dozen features: the way individual letters were formed, the pressure of the pen, characteristic strokes, and even the slant of the handwriting. The examination was conducted in several stages. First, they established Eliza's authentic handwriting style, described its individual characteristics in detail, and assembled a complete picture. Then, the direct comparison began. Each signature on the disputed contracts was examined under high magnification, with its individual details and features carefully analyzed. The experts understood the importance of their task. Their conclusion had to be irrefutable and leave no room for doubt. 2 weeks passed before the police received the first preliminary results. The graphologists were already confident in their findings, but for greater reliability, they decided to repeat the study and brought in an additional expert from another city. After double-checking the data, the specialists prepared a detailed and final report. The report was brief and unequivocal. There was no room for ambiguity. The investigators carefully studied every line of the document. The expert conclusion stated that Eliza's handwriting had a whole range of unique features that were impossible to replicate, even for an experienced person without special knowledge and training. And despite the care and thoroughness with which the signatures on the contracts were forged, the experts managed to find critical differences that ruled out the possibility of authenticity. The most crucial phrase in the conclusion was the graphologist's categorical statement, officially confirming the investigation's suspicions. The signatures on the land subdivision documents, dated April 2016, were not made by the hand of Eliza Greenway. The signatures on the documents are a 100% forgery. This conclusion definitively confirmed the investigation's main theory about Thomas's fraud. Now the police had not only his confession, but also solid scientific proof of the financial motive for the crime. The handwriting analysis completely closed the question of the authenticity of Eliza's signatures, making the case against Thomas legally flawless. The investigators had obtained the most crucial piece of evidence, without which the case could have been challenged in court. Now, they just had to figure out the last stage of this tangled story: how Thomas was able to physically hold Eliza on the farm for 7 years without arousing the slightest suspicion from those around him. After Thomas Greenway confessed to what he had done, the investigators were left to uncover the main thing: the motives for his actions. To his neighbors, Thomas was an ordinary man, an unremarkable farmer who, it seemed, could not have any serious secrets. However, Thomas's confession forced the police to completely reevaluate his image. Thomas explained that the root cause of what happened was financial difficulties. A few years before Eliza's disappearance, he had started gambling and gradually accumulated huge debts. Initially, the losses were small, and Thomas didn't pay much attention to them. But soon he couldn't stop and found himself in a difficult situation, with no means to pay his growing debts. At that moment, the only way out was his wife's land, which she had inherited from her parents. The problem was that Eliza would never have given permission to sell the property. For her, the land was an important memory of her parents, and she would not have agreed to part with it voluntarily. so Thomas decided to act in secret. Taking advantage of the fact that Eliza, after the tragic events, had little interest in the farm's affairs and rarely left the residential part of the property, he forged her signatures and quickly sold the far part of the land. These were remote, seldom visited areas that she might not have seen for a long time. However, his calculation proved wrong. On the evening of May 18, 2016, Eliza accidentally discovered bank statements and documents that revealed the sale of her land. She immediately demanded an explanation. Thomas tried to calm his wife, to convince her not to take any rash steps, promising to sort out the situation, but Eliza was resolute and was about to go to the police immediately. Thomas said that at that moment he was overcome with panic. He tried to restrain Eliza by grabbing her hands, but she broke free abruptly and hit her head hard on the corner of a table. Thomas claimed it all happened quickly and unexpectedly, and he had no intention of harming her. However, instead of calling for doctors, he gave in to fear and decided to hide what had happened. That evening, he hid Eliza in the old, abandoned cellar under the shed. At first, he saw it as a temporary solution to buy time and find a way out, but realizing there was no turning back, he decided to stage Eliza's disappearance. He drove her car to the Remutaka Pass and left her personal belongings inside to create the illusion of a voluntary departure. The investigators asked Thomas a logical question. Why did he leave Eliza alive, exposing himself to the additional risk of being discovered when eliminating her could have hidden his crime forever? Thomas explained that he simply couldn't bring himself to do it. He admitted that he had been deceiving himself, believing that as long as Eliza was alive, his act was not final and irreparable. This helped him justify himself and continue living, albeit in constant fear. In the first few weeks, Thomas truly hoped he could find a way out, but he gradually grew accustomed to the idea that the situation was hopeless. He reduced his interaction with Eliza to a minimum, sustaining her life in the cellar with only the bare necessities. His daily life turned into a continuous cycle of fear and lies, from which he saw no way to escape. Now, after his confession, the investigation had to meticulously reconstruct every event and verify all the circumstances of the crime to confirm Thomas's testimony and build a convincing body of evidence for the court. The reconstruction of events made by the investigation showed how carefully Thomas Greenway had planned every step, and how quickly his plan began to unravel after the new neighbors arrived. After the conflict with Eliza, he did not seek help or tell anyone what had happened. In a state of panic, Thomas moved her to the old cellar under the shed, closing the heavy hatch and masking it with construction debris. This room was deep underground, with thick concrete walls and metal ceilings. Almost no sound could get through. To completely hide the traces, he poured diesel fuel on the floor and scattered bags of fertilizer. Then, Thomas drove Eliza's car to the Remutaka Pass, left her documents and personal belongings inside, and in the morning reported her missing to the police himself. His behavior was convincing. He remained calm, did not arouse suspicion, and gave a detailed account of the argument and voluntary departure. The search of the farm yielded nothing, and the case quickly shifted to the pass where her car was. For the first while, Thomas lived in constant tension. He would visit Eliza, bringing her water and food, trying to keep her alive. But with each passing month, the feeling of fear dulled, and guilt gave way to indifference. He began to appear at the shed less and less frequently, turning his wife into a living reminder of his own mistake. The years dragged on monotonously until in August 2023, the Lee family arrived at the neighboring property. Their appearance was a disaster for Thomas. The house they began to build was only 40 meters from the shed. Now there were always people working nearby, talking, moving equipment. Thomas knew that his usual trips to the shed could raise questions, so he started to avoid the place. He completely stopped visiting Eliza, but he knew this couldn't last long. By September, as the heat intensified, a heavy smell began to emerge from under the shed. Thomas smelled it too, but did nothing. Any attempt to change something, to dig, move, or destroy the evidence, would have meant noise and attention. He was afraid the neighbors would hear or notice. All he could do was wait, hoping the smell would dissipate. When the Lee family first complained about the unpleasant air, Thomas knew the end was near. He didn't run. Fleeing would have made him the prime suspect. All he could do was feign surprise when the police arrived at the farm again. He knew that this time it would all be over. The investigation concluded. Thomas kept Eliza captive not out of malice or a desire to cause pain. His actions were dictated by the fear of exposure. He couldn't bring himself to get rid of his wife because he couldn't take one more step that would turn him into a murderer. But it was this fear that became his trap. 7 years lived in deceit and isolation ended with the very thing he feared most: exposure. The collected evidence and his confession were enough to close the case. The investigators prepared the materials, documented every step Thomas took, and handed the indictment over to the prosecutor's office. Now, only the court had the final say. The trial of Thomas Greenway began in April 2024 and caused a significant public stir. The man who, for many years, had been considered the victim of a tragedy, stood before the court on a whole series of charges that were difficult for those who knew him well to accept. The prosecutor clearly and thoroughly presented the prosecution's case based on the materials of a months-long investigation. The first charge was fraud, specifically the illegal subdivision and sale of Eliza's land. This was followed by the charge of kidnapping and holding his wife captive for 7 years. The final and most serious count was causing harm that led to tragic consequences on that night in May 2016. Graphologists testified at the hearing, confirming that the signatures on the documents had been forged. Next, canine handlers gave their testimony, explaining the details of the failed search in 2016 and why the specially trained dogs were unable to find Eliza. The testimonies were restrained and specific, which enhanced the sense of credibility and persuasiveness of the collected evidence. Thomas's lawyer, for his part, did not deny the facts, but merely tried to mitigate the circumstances of the case. He insisted that the crime was not premeditated, but arose spontaneously as a result of intense fear of imminent exposure. He tried to convince the court that his client had committed all subsequent actions while in a state of extreme panic and without fully realizing the consequences of his actions. Thomas himself showed almost no emotion throughout the hearing and did not engage in dialogue with either the court or his lawyer. He only periodically shifted his gaze from the judge to the testifying witnesses, as if in a state of stupor. The jury retired to deliberate and returned fairly quickly with a decision. They found Thomas guilty on all counts, without exception. The judge took all the circumstances into account and announced the sentence: 30 years in prison, to be served in a maximum security correctional facility. The increased sentence was due to the multiple crimes and the particular severity of the situation in which the victim spent 7 years of her life in inhumane conditions. When the verdict was read, Silence fell over the courtroom, broken only after a few moments by muffled remarks of approval from those present. Thomas showed no reaction, as if he had been prepared to hear exactly that verdict. He simply stood up and silently allowed himself to be led from the courtroom. The trial was over. The long story, which had begun almost 8 years earlier, had come to its logical conclusion. The court proceedings had settled all the questions and completely shattered the image of the unfortunate widower that Thomas had created. Now, all that was left for him was to accept the court's decision and the consequences of his actions. After the sentencing, the story of Thomas Greenway gradually faded from the center of public attention, but its echoes were felt in the daily lives of local residents for a long time. The farm was put up for auction several times, but no buyers were found. Eventually, the authorities decided to demolish all the buildings, including the infamous shed. All that remained of the farm was a flat concrete slab. The Lee family, who had accidentally set the chain of events in motion, sold their plot and soon moved to another region. In an interview, they explained that they had decided on a change of scenery, as living under the constant media attention and among disturbing memories was difficult. The investigation had thoroughly uncovered the course of events, established the motives, methods, and circumstances of the crime. Legally, everything was closed and documented. The only point that remained unexplained concerned Thomas Greenway himself. The investigation was never able to understand how a man who seemed completely ordinary on the outside managed to hide his true nature for 7 years, maintaining the illusion of a normal life in front of his neighbors every day. The farm is gone. The case is legally closed forever. But the psychological enigma of Thomas Greenway's personality remains unsolved. A reminder that behind a seemingly ordinary life can hide a reality incomprehensible to those around.